Hello dear students, this is the third class of the course Web Programming. Last week हमने कोर्स का ओवरव्यू देखा और कुछ हिस्टोरिकल डेवलपमेंट्स डिस्कस की along the path of इंटरनेट एंड द वर्ल्ड वाइड वेब. आज हम कुछ बेसिक टर्मिनोलॉजीज़ और टेक्नोलॉजीज़ की बात करेंगे जो वेब के अंदर फ्रीक्वेंटली यूज़ होती हैं ताकि आप इनके साथ फेमिलियराइज हो जाएं और आप जब डिफरेंट टेक्निक्स को सर्च करें सो इफ़ यू ऑलरेडी हैव सम अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ देम तो आपके लिए आगे काम करना आसान होगा. सो टुडे वी आर गोइंग टू गो थ्रू देम एंड फ्रॉम नेक्स्ट क्लास वी आर गोइंग टू स्टार्ट द प्रोग्रामिंग विद HTML. So let's just look into some of the basic technologies and terminologies of web programming. First of all, as we start working in the actual development of this course, तो आप दो तरह की development करेंगे. One is called front end development and the other is called back end development. Front end is all related to developing the interfaces of web page और back end के अंदर हम उसकी जो actual working है, जो different functionalities है जिसके लिए लोग आपकी website को use करेंगे उसको जो कोर फंक्शनैलिटी को डेवलप करने में काम करते हैं. उसके साथ ही आपको कुछ डेटा स्टोर भी करना पड़ेगा तो डेटाबेसेस वगैरह जो हैं वो भी आपको यूज़ करने होंगे. सो बेसिकली इन दिस वन कोर्स वी आर गोइंग टू टच ऑन बोथ द फ्रंट एंड डेवलपमेंट एंड बैक एंड डेवलपमेंट. इट्स ऑलमोस्ट इम्पॉसिबल टू कवर देम फ्रॉम एंड टू एंड क्योंकि अब दोनों के अंदर काफ़ी ज़्यादा डेप्थ है, डिफरेंट फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं, बहुत सारे टूल्स हैं जो आप यूज़ कर सकते हैं. बट द मेन आइडिया इज़ टू गिव यू इनफ एक्सपर्टीज़ के आप अपने तौर पे आगे फर्दर इसके अंदर एक्सप्लोर कर सकें. सो फ्रंट एंड में वी आर गोइंग टू स्टार्ट विद HTML which stands for hypertext markup language and with HTML we are going to present the layout of our web pages. So आप अपने पेज के अंदर जो भी कंटेंट डालना चाहते हैं वो आप HTML के अंदर उसमें कोड करेंगे. Then if you are following XHTML rules, so that is going to make your HTML XHTML. XML is a technology that is frequently used for compressed data storage and communication across multiple machines. For example, अगर आपका वेब पेज किसी ने ब्राउज़र के अंदर खोला हुआ है so that is a web client and if that client wants to share some information with the server, so XML is one way of doing it. With XML, the structured data can be easily communicated across different machines. And most of the languages can support processing XML files. Although there is a better technology that can communicate the same data without losing its structure in a much more compact way, which is JSON, and that is also what we are going to touch on in this course. In fact, with JSON, the use of XML is quite reduced now. DHTML is dynamic HTML and that comes when you have some client-side scripting language. तो अगर आप JavaScript and its library jQuery को use करेंगे, so it means that your web page is going to have some dynamic effects. With the help of those dynamic effects, you are going to improve the experience of your viewer ताकि आप जो है उसकी प्रेजेंटेशंस को रन टाइम पे मॉडिफाई करें, उसके CSS को मॉडिफाई करें, नए एलिमेंट्स इंट्रोड्यूस करें, पेज के अंदर कुछ एलिमेंट्स को रिमूव करें या उनको हाइड करें. सो ये सारी कैपेबिलिटी जो है इट कम्स विद द क्लाइंट साइड स्क्रिप्टिंग लैंग्वेज. इनफैक्ट कुछ रीजनेबल लॉजिक भी आप इसके साथ इम्प्लीमेंट कर सकते हैं. हाउएवर यू हैव टू बी कॉन्शियस ऑफ द फैक्ट के द डेटा एंड द प्रोग्राम दैट यू आर यूजिंग with JavaScript is actually the one that you are sharing across the communication line to your client. So anything that is more related to the core of your business should not be implemented in JavaScript. But some of the related functionalities can be implemented and that is actually going to reduce the load on the server. इस तरह से अगर आप कुछ कोड एग्जीक्यूशन लोड जो है वो सर्वर से कम करेंगे और उसको जावास्क्रिप्ट के तौर पे क्लाइंट की मशीन को भेज देंगे, सो दैट इज़ गोइंग टू सेव अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम ऑन द सर्वर दैट कैन बी यूटिलाइज्ड फॉर सर्विंग अदर रिक्वेस्ट्स. तो दिस बेसिकली इंट्रोड्यूसेस द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ फैट क्लाइंट एंड थिन क्लाइंट. अगर सर्वर ज़्यादा काम करवाता है जावास्क्रिप्ट के थ्रू अपने क्लाइंट से, सो दैट इज़ व्हाट वी कॉल fat client, and in case of thin client, the server is doing most of the functionality by itself and is only passing a small fraction of it to the client. So इन दोनों के बीच में ट्रेड ऑफ है, जैसे हमने बात की कि अगर आप ज़्यादा लोड क्लाइंट पे डालेंगे तो सर्वर के पास टाइम फ्री अप हो जाएगा और वो दूसरे रिक्वेस्ट को प्रोसेस कर सकता है उस टाइम में, लेकिन आप सिर्फ वही डेटा और उसके रिलेटेड प्रोग्राम्स जो हैं वो जावास्क्रिप्ट में इम्प्लीमेंट करें व्हेन दैट इजंट गोइंग टू बी हार्मफुल फॉर योर बिजनेस. और उसके जो दूसरे एथिकल एस्पेक्ट्स हैं, किसी का पर्सनल डेटा वगैरह जो है, दैट शुडंट आल्सो बी so anything that is sensitive in terms of its privacy and security should not be implemented through JavaScript. Then once we have this front end implementation, then in order to make things actually work, आपके पास back end पे भी कोई technology होनी चाहिए. बैक एंड में आप PHP, Java, .NET, Node.js ये सारे यूज़ कर सकते हैं. Node.js is getting more and more popular for a couple of reasons. First of all, the websites developed in Node.js are very fast, although they are single page applications. So if that is what you need, it can be very fast in Node.js. Secondly, it reduces the load on the developers also, because now they have to use the same language, which is JavaScript, for developing both the front end and the back end. तो दो अलग-अलग languages जो हैं या चार multiple languages सीखने की या उसमें कोड करने की ज़रूरत नहीं होगी. Finally, as we said, when you start developing your back-end technologies, obviously you are going to be storing multiple information about the products, about your users. So anything that is of core importance to the business must be stored somewhere. So files, obviously we all know, is not a reliable way of storing data, particularly in a structured format. So therefore, any of the databases can be used for supporting the back-end. So there will be operations at the server side where the data may be requested for read, write, and insertion purposes. At times you may also need to delete the data. So basically it's the responsibility of the server side scripting like PHP or Java or whatever you are using कि वो look after करे database को भी और database के साथ communicate करे through the queries. So just beginning with the different technologies that can be used. There can be servers, web clients. We are going to talk about the web application architecture, that how a client and web communicate with one another, what is the URL, hosting, web application protocols, and ports. Okay, so let's just start with an intranet, intra with an A. So an intranet is basically a local network that is part of an organization or maybe few machines in a building. These machines are locally connected and they can communicate with one another, but when they have access to an ISP, which is an internet service provider, so that basically allows these machines to communicate across the internet. The same way you are connected, or your network or intranet is connected to the internet with the help of that ISP or internet service provider, there are many such local networks that are connected to the internet the same way. So you can think of the internet as a big network that has got routers and switches in the middle, whose main job is basically to receive the data or whatever the request is and just pass it on to another link for reliably and efficient delivery to the target. Whereas everything that is connected to the fringes or the edges are basically the actual machines that are being used, are basically the machines that are being used by the end users. As we discussed the concept of local networks, with this comes the concept of deep web. It's basically the different portals and repositories that cannot be accessed by the search engines. We cannot get into all the details that are being stored over there, and only limited people for a limited purpose have access to such data. it is said that most of the content that is on the web is part of the deep web, that cannot be accessed by general public through search engines. So the surface web, the things that we can search for and that we can access on the web, is basically just a very small fraction of the actual content that is available on the web. I think it is assumed that it's only 3% of the actual content, while almost 97% of the content that is available on the web is part of the deep web. Now, the university's portals, the business portals, every such portal is basically part of the deep web, because no university would want anyone from outside to have access to the contact and the GPA and the course details of their students. The same way, no organization would want someone from outside to have access to the salaries, the personal details of their employees. So that's why most of these portals are being kept or protected behind a password, and only limited people have access to them. And then, of course, there is a dark side to it as well, which is called the dark web, where such portals which cannot be publicly accessed are being used for malicious activities. So internet is basically the whole thing of connection of all the computers and devices and machines that can communicate with one another, and it can be used for a number of purposes like emailing, online gaming, file transfers, etc. The World Wide Web is only a small fraction of it, and that is basically the communication between a browser and some web pages that are stored on a server. So we should not mix the World Wide Web with the internet, where internet is the whole thing that is providing a number of other facilities as well, whereas World Wide Web is only a component of it, and there is everything that is only accessed through the web browser or the web client. For example, Firefox, Chrome, etc. are all web clients. So the things that you do not access through your browser is basically part of the internet but not part of the World Wide Web. That includes Skype, Slack, Zoom, any such softwares that you have installed that is using the internet but are not part of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee is known as the father of the World Wide Web due to his contributions and accomplishments for introducing the World Wide Web for the first time in 1989 or 90. At that time, he was working with his team at CERN laboratories in Switzerland, and they were actually looking for something where they could actually make something publicly available that could be accessed by anyone and everyone without actually knowing the particular IP address of a machine. So let's just try to understand why such a mechanism or technology was needed. Before this, if two computers would have to communicate with one another, just like in a peer-to-peer communication, they need to have the IP address of one another. They would send a request to another machine, and if that is being accepted, then the two devices would communicate with one another. So that was the mechanism that was used for communicating the data or important information between two machines. But what if we have lots of information on a machine and that we would want to have and that we would want to share with anyone and everyone? So in that case, in peer-to-peer connection, you'll have to wait until the link is free for you to connect, and then you would have access to that information. So that was the main requirement that actually led to the discovery of the World Wide Web, where a server is being introduced, a particular URL is assigned to that to each resource on their server, and now many people can have access to the same machine all at the same time without knowing the IP address or without having a dedicated connection to that machine. So this was a huge breakthrough, and that made the end users have access to lots of data, and it was already observed that this thing is going to be a huge success in the future. And therefore, different entities were interested in having ownership of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee and his team introduced the first language in which this content is going to be communicated, that is HTML, that is still being used for the same purpose. Although we have the 5th version of it now, they introduced the first web client or the first browser, they introduced the first web server, and the first protocol that would actually make the client and the server communicate with one another in order to transfer this HTML based content. So as we said, they introduced the URL to uniquely identify a resource on the web. Now just like in a network, every computer has got its own unique IP that is going to help to get to that computer. The same way, any resource that is available on the web that can be requested through the web client has a unique URL. It can be a PDF file. Now in today's world, we can have different kinds of file formats on the web. It can be a video, it can be a picture, it can be an audio file, but at that time it was just the HTML files. So every resource on the web has got a unique URL, and that is going to, and requesting that URL is basically going to connect to that resource. So it's the same like machines have IPs in the internet. HTTP is the protocol that communicates between client and server in order to share where the request for the URL is being taken from the client or the browser to the server, and the server responds with the HTML page and the associated files, which can be the styling files, the JavaScript files, and sends it back to the client. HTML was being introduced as the language to publish the content or documents, and a software program was being introduced that would act as a server and would respond to the HTML and would respond to the URL queries that are brought by the HTTP protocol. He also played a key role in founding the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which would soon become the international standards organization that would oversee the growth of the web. So anything that is decided about the future of the web is being discussed and mutually accepted by the different representatives of the World Wide Web Consortium. Whenever there is a new version of the language that is coming up, or anything about the future of the web, it's all being decided at this consortium, which played a key role in keeping the World Wide Web free for everyone. Although there were different organizations that were interested at the time to buy shares in the World Wide Web and use it for selling to make money. There were some security agencies also that were interested in order to use this technology for the security purposes only. But the consortium made it very clear that it has to be free for humanity and everyone should benefit from this. There are different features based on which we can differentiate between the web applications and the desktop applications. And we need to understand these differences, because when we develop a web-based application, we should be aware of the strengths and the weaknesses and the demands and expectations of that application. So accessibility is one thing where a web-based application overpowers a desktop application. These applications, the web-based applications, can be accessed from anywhere around the world if someone knows the particular URL of that application, or if it is provided as a clickable link. So it's accessible to everyone and to anyone, whereas in case of desktop applications, it can only be accessed if you are personally sitting on that computer or if you have a virtual access to that machine. Usability is another important aspect of the web-based applications. It's independent of the operating system, and therefore a web application developed with any operating system can be accessed with any other operating system, and therefore there isn't any problems of compatibility. Thirdly, another advantage of the web-based applications is the easier way of rolling out the updates. As you know, you have this one application sitting at one machine and that is being accessible to the whole world. So it's basically a centralized unit that is being accessed by anywhere around the world. So it's a lot easier to modify and to introduce updates into such a software or program. So if you access a website today and that website has updated few hours later, and the next day if you access the same website, everyone from around the world is now going to have access to the updated version of the website. So there isn't any problem of updation because there is just one copy of it. Everyone is accessing that one copy, and if you update it, everyone is going to have access to the updated copy. This isn't the case with the desktop based applications, where the updates are being introduced in the form of patches and plugins, and every local machine will have to explicitly run that patch or plugin in order to update their software. Then centralized storage is another benefit of the web-based applications that they have, which means that there is just one storage, and if that is particularly and if that is properly secured, so you shouldn't be worried about your data, because and it can be actually well protected because it's all stored in one place, and which isn't the case with network based applications, where different machines will have access to different storages and will have different levels of security. Of course, with advantages, there are also some disadvantages of the web-based applications. In fact, they may not be looked at as disadvantages, but concerns that we need to address before launching our web-based application. If we do not address these problems, or if we are not proactive about these issues, they may actually convert into problems. But if they are properly handled, then there shouldn't be a problem. So one such thing is to have an active internet connection. As we said, a web-based application is expected to be accessible 24/7. So you don't know when a request is going to come, and the server should respond immediately. Therefore, there has to be some support for that web server, which is on which your website resides, to have a 24/7 active connection. So that means 24/7 power supply and 24/7 internet connection, so that it can serve the needs of the clients without any interruption. Security concerns is another problem or another thing that you need to be proactive about. Now, as we said, a desktop-based application could only be used by a limited number of users, and therefore you can apply security checks on them, whereas a web-based application can be accessed by anyone and everyone from around the world. So there is basically a range of people or users who are going to be using your website. There may be people who would hardly have any understanding of using basic computer tools, and there will be very expert programmers. Now, in order to make things easier for the new or novice users, you will have to provide more support, and that support could actually lead to security leakages. So therefore, there has to be a balance between the two, where you are providing enough support to the end user while you are also being very cautious about the security of your website. For example, if someone has typed a username and a password at random and clicked on login, so if you provide the feedback that the password is incorrect, so that basically ensures that the email address is actually correct. So now if that person is a hacker, so they can actually try different passwords keeping the same email address. So if you do not provide such feedback, the new users, the novice users, are going to have problems. But if you provide them, then the expert users or the hackers can actually use it to their advantage. So therefore, you have to be very concerned about the feedback or the kind of information that you provide, and also make sure that everything is properly secured, that is having access to your data and your server-side scripts. We should also and as we discussed earlier with the topic fat client and thin client, that we should also be very concerned about the programs and the data on which they run that we are using at the client side, as the hackers may also use that as a gateway to have access to your servers. Next, there are concerns over the storage, licensing, and use of the uploaded data. The problems with certain websites on certain browsers is another issue, particularly for the developers, because a single web page is going to come up differently on different web clients, and therefore the programmers need to make sure that they are at least properly accessible and visible on the prominent browsers and their latest versions. This problem was more prominent in the last decade, where there was much wider gap between the web clients or the browsers, but in recent times I think it's getting better, and now when a website is being developed for one browser, it looks quite well on the other browsers also, although there are minor issues that can still be resolved, which means that the browsers are actually getting intelligent. They won't completely change the look and feel of your website, but there still can be little changes, and that shouldn't also appear for good websites. One particular scenario would be that all the different browsers have different default settings for formatting the content on the page. So if you are not defining the styling for any particular content, so each browser is going to show it with its own default setting, and therefore it's going to come up differently on these browsers. Then limited access to the operating system can prevent software and hardware from being installed or accessed. So let's just discuss the different key technologies that we discussed one by one. So one is a server. A server is just a small piece of software that can be installed on a computer, and if it is installed, that would convert that computer into a server. So any computer can be converted into a server. However, any of our local machines do not have the capability to cope up with the load of being a server. So therefore, it's not a good idea to convert any machine to a server. There are dedicated server machines that are actually secured and have the computational power to be a server. But we can use our local machines as server for the sake of development and testing our websites. And once we are done, we should look for either dedicated servers or purchase some hosting space on a server and host our websites over there and let them be accessible to everyone. So a server has shared resources. When a computer is converted into a server, so people can have access to their server, but now another thing is there must be something important or valuable for the end users on that server that they should visit your server. So any resource that your website has is basically the reason why people are going to visit your website. It can be sports articles, it can be some blog, it can be some repository of maybe players and their scores like Quick Info, it can be news articles like BBC. So anything valuable that you want to share with your end users is basically the resource that resides on your server. A server should receive requests all the time and respond to them. And that software that we talked earlier is when installed on a machine, converts it into a server, basically instills this capability into a machine. That when a server software is being installed, this allows that software basically allows the computer to listen to HTTP requests all the time, and when it receives one, it has the capability to generate a response. A server should also run continuously for longer durations with high efficiency, security, and reliability. So this is what we discussed, that these are the reasons why we shouldn't convert any end user machine to a server. It may require special hardware, of course, because of the load that a server may be when multiple people are accessing it all at the same time. So that's why we have dedicated servers. There are different types of servers. As we said, a server is basically a software that allows a machine to receive requests and response. So that request can be of any type. So if you discuss web server in particular, so it's basically a software that allows a computer to receive requests on the HTTP about some URL. But there can be other types of servers as well that would listen to their particular protocol and would serve requests accordingly. Some of the popular web servers that are available are Apache HTTP server by Apache Software, Apache Tomcat for Java-based applications, Internet Information Services IIS by Microsoft, and Sun Java by Sun Microsystems. So these are the different softwares that are being publicly available and introduced by all these companies that can be used as a web server. We can also have an FTP server, and that server is going to listen to the FTP protocol, and any request that is being received for a file from the client is going to be responded. We have application servers that would actually listen to the requests and would perform and would process the request for a particular server-side scripting language and would pass a static version of that copy to the web server. Basically, as you can see in the diagram, an application server cannot be used independently, but basically it supports the web server. So if a website, so when an end user sends a request to a web server and the request is for a static page, the web server would actually pull that page off and will send it to the end user. However, if that page is a dynamic page, we haven't discussed that, but let's think of it as a page that would change its content under the same URL continuously, is what we call a dynamic page. And in order to have this dynamic capability, it must have some backend scripting language. So whenever a web server receives a request for a dynamic page, so it does not have the capability to process the dynamic part of the content. It just delivers static pages, so it would pass it on to the application server. The application server would execute the dynamic part of the page, which is going to be on a server side, which is going to be in a server-side scripting language like PHP, Java, .NET. And when those lines are being executed, that is going to extract a static copy of that dynamic code, and that is shared with the web server, and the web server passes it on to the end user. Then we have email servers, and the job of an email server is basically to respond to the email clients, and the protocol that they use is SMTP. We have proxy servers, and as the name shows, the proxy server doesn't do much of its own task, but it's rather plays the role of a middleman, and everything that it receives, it would apply some checks on it and passes it on to the target. So the main job of a proxy server is basically to ensure certain rules. So it can be used in different organizations where they have a policy for accessing web, and when that policy or security checks are being applied on a proxy machine, every request to the web is being passed through their proxy server, which ensures that the organizational rules are being followed. We have database servers that would request to the queries for data. We have DNS servers whose main job is basically to provide the IP address for a given URL and the other way around. So basically the URLs that we use are strings that are easier for us end users to remember, whereas at the back end it's just the IPs that work As we said, the web server is going to be a machine that is going to have an IP address on the internet. So in order to reach that server, all the parsing is being, all the traversing is and routing is being done through IP address, although we do not know or see that in the front end, but that is what actually happens in the back end. We just provide the URL, and the first thing that is being done is to convert that URL into an IP address, and when it reaches the server, it looks for that particular file. And the same way, when it reaches back, the domain name or the URL is being retrieved from that particular address, from that particular IP. So that's what DNS servers are for. They have a mapping of domain, they have a mapping of IP addresses and domain names of servers. Then we have audio and video servers that are particularly used for streaming of audio and video. We have chat servers, Gremlin servers, and they all have their own dedicated purposes, but the main mechanism is the same, that there is going to be multiple clients. They all these clients are going to send requests to the server, and the server is going to respond. DNS, as we discussed earlier, is basically provides a mapping of the IP addresses and the names of different web applications available on the servers. So whenever a request is being made to a server, the first thing is to go to a DNS server and get the IP address for that particular web page that is being requested, and then the server is being traversed to the IP address. Web clients, as we said, is basically the software installed on a client machine that helps to request or send requests to the web server. They provides us a good GUI that basically can display the HTML and help us interact with those web pages. We have a number of such web clients, and whatever people use is basically based on their own personal preferences. The protocol, as we discussed earlier as well, is basically the language that is being spoken and understood by the client and the server. So when they communicate with one another, they have these binary codes that they both understand and share with each other, and that is what we call protocols. So HTTP is basically a language of binary codes that the web server and the web client understands. So whenever a client sends a request, it basically links that the request for the URL and associates some codes with it. Reading that code, the server understands what the client is requesting for, and based on whether the page is available or not, or whatever is being the case, the server sends the content along with another code. So basically those codes are a language or a communication mechanism between the client and the server, and that is used as meta information, or the information along with the actual request that facilitates the client and the server to understand each other. In case of web, it is the HTTP protocol, and of course for other client and servers there are many other protocols that they use. Next, we are going to discuss the web application architecture. Again, we briefly touched on it in the previous slides also, but to discuss it again here, whenever we have the client machines that are connected to the internet with some ISP, so they are going to make a request for a particular URL to all the way through the internet to this server, and when the server receives the request, it's going to pull those pages that are being requested and send it back along the way to the client machine. If they need some processing of backend technology, so that is being sent to the web application, to the web server. If the web server needs to have access to some data, so that requests to the database server, so that sends a request to the database server. The database server responds with the data that is being requested. The web server uses that data to get a static copy of the page, sends it back to this web server, and the server sends it back to all the way through the internet to the end user. So that's what we have actually discussed, how the client and the server communicates. there may be multiple requests or a request loop between the user, between the end user and a server, and therefore the server also may have to have a mechanism that would actually help it to recognize particular clients. So each time the server responds to client with some files, before the client make another request, the server may have served hundreds of other requests in between that time. So the server also need to have a mechanism that would actually help it remember certain users so that it could provide with personalized responses. We would come to that, how it's being done and what is being needed for that. The architecture of the application on the server can be a three-tier architecture, where we have the presentation tier that has everything that is supposed to be sent to the end user, that is all the HTML, CSS, JavaScript and the associated frameworks and libraries. Then the logic tier that is going to have the main application that is being implemented at the back end with the server-side scripting language. This is something that is core to that represents the core of the business, and then the associated data that is stored as the data tier. So we would try to have these three tiers as independent or decoupled as possible. Of course, they are going to communicate with one another, but we try to reduce their interdependency on each other, their coupling, because in that case changing code in one piece is going to incur errors in the other parts of the code. So therefore we would try to have a defined mechanism of how these tiers are going to communicate with one another, to have independent code and to have code that is properly structured and that can be easily updated. URLs or URIs, as we said, are basically the unique address of any resource on the web page. It can be an HTML page, or in today's world it can be any other resource like an audio, video file, an image, a PDF, a Word document. Anything that is stored on some web server is going to have its unique URL. In order to understand what a URL, what different components of that URL actually means, so at first we have the protocol that is being used, which in case of web is either going to be HTTP or HTTPS. HTTPS is the secured version of the protocol that use SSL for encrypting all the communication, that is the requests and responses, so that no one in between the client and server can have access to the data, or if they have access, it should be they shouldn't get any sense out of it. So as we said, between the server and the client, the request and response is going to pass through a number of switches and routers. So if anyone anyone on those machines is storing any of useful data, so in case it is encrypted, they won't have access to the actual messages. Then we have the domain name or the actual website, followed by a colon and the port number. Port number cannot be generally seen on web pages because the default port number is 80, and if that is being used by the web server, then it is just ignored. Otherwise any other port number is going to be part of the URL. And then based on the directory structure where that actual file is that we are requesting, the next few bits of the URL is going to be structured accordingly. Like in this case, we have some directory, name directory, and then a page.html. This basically gives the same kind of information. Particularly this part is what we need to focus on, that as we can see over here, the request is for a dynamic page, and the client is also sharing some information. It's sending some supporting information to the server so that the server can respond accordingly with more specific content. So the support provided over here is that it's sending requests to this dynamic page, and it's saying that the page number is equal to 17, and then it's looking for some article on that page. So the server is going to use this information, get this 17 as the page number from the URL, and make it utilize it the query to get relevant content from the database and send it back to the client. So the server can actually make its request more specific, just like we see in search engines, that when you put a query request, that query request is being passed on to the server, so that the server could actually, or the search engine could actually respond back with the most related resources that are relevant to that query. So when a website is ready, we would have to host it somewhere. As we said, it's not a good idea to make or to turn your own personal computer into a web server, so you would be buying some server space and some domain name that is going to be used for accessing your website. There are lots of free, cheap and reasonable services. They all have their own strengths and weaknesses, so just go through them and have a look which one is going to be more favorable for you. To start with, I would suggest either free services or the cheap ones that you can easily maintain, and as you start to get more visitors on your website, you can switch to the to a better or a higher service. There are different types of websites. They all have their own dedicated purposes. So they all follow the same web and client mechanism, and they all have their particular URLs for all the resources and are being accessed through the HTTP or HTTPS protocol. But these categorization of websites is basically being done through the actual purpose that these websites serve. So we have static websites. Static websites are the ones that do not change its nature even when accessed multiple times. They basically just have the static part, which is the HTML, or just the front end, which is the CSS, HTML and JavaScript. So users can have the same content, user can visit the same content on these pages each time they visit it, unless the content is being updated by someone on the server. So there is no personalization or any and nothing is being stored on the server with respect to the end users. Then we have dynamic websites, and these are basically the web applications that are having a more dedicated and more personalized services. So users would make accounts on them, and then whatever they do is being stored with respect to each user. So next time you visit, all your personal details are being brought up and you can proceed from there. Then there are different types of dynamic websites based on based on the purpose for which they are used. We already discussed search engines. So search engines again are dynamic websites that responds to queries with related resources, and of course they store some information about us, because next time when we put a query, it basically shows us the resources that we have already visited. So it means that it's also that by the time that it serves our needs, but it's also storing information about us, and the purpose of that is basically to serve a user better by having personalized responses. I think we discussed this earlier also, that in case of a static web page, the server would just respond with that static page in the associated resources, whereas in case of dynamic page, the web server would actually pass that on to the application server in order to process that page, get a static copy of it and send it back to the server, and then through the internet to the end user. So we discussed this part. With Web 2.0, more and more websites allowed the end users to have their say on the websites. They would have the comment section and all that. So basically it was becoming more and more common practice to have end users have their feedback on any resource that they access on the World Wide Web. And then there are these social media platforms that are basically supported by end users, and where every content that you see is basically from the end user. The platform, the social media network, is basically just providing the platform for it. We see websites like YouTube where every content that we see is basically posted by end users. So Web 2.0 basically refers to the 2000s and onwards era, where content from the end users were becoming more and more important. Before this time, only the server or the people who are managing the servers or who are owning the applications would add the content and would produce the content, and the end users were just the consumers of that content. Okay, there are different types of websites, as we said. So we have content management systems, which actually became popular with blogging. So before this, in any dynamic websites, people would just be concerned about the content that is related to their actual business. For example, if they are selling books, so they would store the details of particular books on the website, but the general content that come up on the website may not be of that importance. So that could be directly coded into the HTML pages. But a time came when the content itself became more and more important. As we said, in blogging, if you have good writing skills and you are talking about or writing about the content that people are interested in reading, so you can actually earn through advertisements. So that was the time when the content itself became a good resource, and it was considered that the content should also be stored in the web page, should be stored in the databases and should be preserved with security checks that we have for the actual product details. And another facility that it provided was that it separated the content from the interface or the presentation. So when they are being separated, any presentation can be installed, and directly within a few clicks, all the content that you have on your website can now be presented to the end user in a completely different presentation. So this is another thing that was achieved when the content was separated from the presentation. For those of you who already have some understanding of HTML, will realize this by the fact that if we have paragraphs, links, headings, and we actually hard code our content into it, so if you want to change our content or HTML or its styles, we have to actually take care of the content also, because that is also hard coded into those pages. But if everything like the content of the headings, the paragraphs, the links is being stored in the databases, then we do not have anything meaningful in the presentation. We just have the variables that will populate the data from the databases. So now we can just switch the presentations without worrying about content, because that is already being separated from the presentation, and that content can be viewed with a number of presentations just in a couple of clicks. Thirdly, it provided with backend admin support or backend support that allowed those people who do not have any expertise of programming to actually run their own websites and manage it. So that basically led to the success of CMSs, and now we see lots of CMSs in different languages that are being used by all these experts of different fields who are sharing their valuable knowledge with the world through their CMSs. Some of the few popular ones are Drupal, WordPress, Joomla. Then we have the web portals, as we said, that they are basically storing information about a particular business or particular niche, and only people of that niche or business are having access to them, and it's used for a dedicated purpose. These portals are basically having valuable information, and since they only are developed for a particular community, so therefore the presentation is kept simple and compact, because it's not supposed to it's not considered to support end users, but only the people who are working in a particular organization or who have a particular set of expertise. Then we have the e-commerce websites. We all are familiar with them. They sell or do their business through websites. We have social networking websites with the main objective that people interact with each other, have connections with one another, and socialize on the internet. We have blogging websites, as we discussed. Then we have forums, where again people share their problems and get feedback on them from experts and other peers in the same area. We have e-learning websites that allow people to learn online, and this is also another very popular area with many universities having their e-learning component or module where they support long distance learning for students. We have e-governance, where people are given access to their two different where people are given access to different projects that are run by the government. We have e-storages like Dropbox, like Google Drive, that allows to store our valuable files on some cloud. We have e-services, where an application that we would have otherwise installed on our machine is now being installed on a server, and we can just have access to their servers through the URL and directly use it without actually installing that installing that application on our machine. We have mirror websites that actually are the exact copies of the actual website, and in case there is a problem with one copy, the other is going to serve users. And we have online gaming websites. So there are a lot of such online or web-based applications, and they are serving different needs of people. We have been talking about or using the word protocols on and off in this whole lecture. So as we said earlier as well, there's language used by the client and the server to communicate. The different protocols that are being used are HTTP for transferring hypertext markup languages and its associated files. If it is encrypted, then it is the HTTPS version of it. FTP protocol is used for communicating files. SMTP, or simple mail transfer protocol, is used for communicating between the email server and the email client. Ports, of course, we have physical ports also, but here ports is what by ports we mean the logical ports, and the main purpose of these ports is basically to help the content or the response that is being received from the internet or the outside world to realize that when it has reached the end user computer through its IP, then the port basically helps to end up that content into the application that actually requested it. So if Zoom has made a request, or some content is supposed to appear in Zoom, so the port number of Zoom is going to direct that content from the machine to that actual application. So the client and server use IP addresses in order to traverse that content between the client and the server, but then to actually let it reach the actual application that has made the request or for which the request was being made. So that is being done through the port number. So anything that is reaching a computer with the port number of 80 is going to be, at the client side, is going to be sent to the browser, and at the server it's going to be forwarded to the web server. The same way, anything with a port number of 53 is going to be forwarded to the DNS. So everything has their dedicated port number. They can be changed. They are just logical numbers used by these servers, and if a server wants to communicate with its client with a port number that is different, so it can do so, and then every client that knows that port number can communicate with that particular server. These are some other related terminologies that you should be aware of. What a virus is, hacking, search engine optimization, plugins and patches, what is open source, what is an internet service provider, intranet, navigation, flash that is being used for animated earlier, but not used much in these days due to their poor support for search engine optimization. FTP, firewall, Ajax, bots, crawlers, spiders. So these are the terminologies that I would expect you to explore a little online, and the different extensions in which a web page can come are HTML, HTML, PHP, ASPX, JSP, and of course there are a lot many, but these are the extensions that you would often see as the end of a URL. I have few videos that I would also share through the classroom with you to just have a look at them, and that is all for today's lecture. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.